Ghost of a Memory by Phoenix Boy. Chapter 21. James had to admit it. He was really looking forward to Christmas this year. It would be his first with a family of sorts that was mostly unsullied by darker overtones of the war. The two forces this time hadn't yet engaged in earnest, and for the moment they would have the chance to celebrate. In anticipation, he had already gone to buy presents. That had taken a great deal of thought. How well did he have to know someone as James to buy them a present without suspicion? What about Harry's friends that he longed to talk to again but didn't yet know? In the end, he had decided to be sensible. Albus would be receiving 2 pairs of socks, one striped, one polka dots, both in the most garish colors he could find. Claudius had been given a new feeding bucket, much to his disgust. He was being left at Hogwarts under the care of the house elves. Abe himself would get a new muggle book on superstitions related to goats, and Draco was getting a new dagger complete with a poison bottle. Very proudly, James had marched into a toy shop to buy little Harry a cuddly dragon as his first present from his godfather. He had even wrapped this one himself. Or attempted to. It was lucky that Harry was not yet at the age to care about the quality of the wrapping. Hermione received a new calendar, and Ron a signed poster of the cannons. One of James's housemates from university had joined them, and it had been quite easy to get hold of. His reasoning for getting him one was supposedly as a thank you present for looking after Alastair. Hermione, of course, had spent a lot of time researching with and talking to him, so it was known that they were friends. Severus had been horrendously difficult. He didn't have any obvious hobbies in the same way that Ron did, and James didn't think he'd appreciate a joke present in the same way as Hermione did. He was certainly harder than Harry. At last, Albus had pointed out that there was a perfectly good basilisk carcass sitting in the Chamber of Secrets, which could be harvested for some high-valuable potions ingredients. After much discussion, Severus and James had decided that to Alastair they were now at least uncle, if not father figures, and as such, a present would be a good idea. Severus had once gone to Grimmauld Place to consult with Simon, and they thought they had a good idea. They had bought him a broom, a Nimbus 2001. It was not a particularly expensive broom, or a particularly good one in today's market, but it was a broom of his very own. Of course, given school rules, one of them would have to look after it for him during term time. Over the week and a half remaining before Christmas Day, James had also found the time to make the necessary alterations to Severus's costume for the ball, and to obtain the necessary sweets to complete the disguise. Christmas Day itself came at last, and James woke up at the crack of dawn. Given the time of year, this was about 8 o'clock. He bounded out of bed, dressed in jeans and a green dress shirt, and walked cheerfully upstairs to breakfast. For once, he was intending to be happy, even hyper, maybe, and show it. When else could he do that, if not Christmas? Unsurprisingly, he wasn't alone in the Great Hall. 5 of the 7 students, all of them Gryffindors, staying for the holidays, were already there, although none of the teachers had yet made an appearance. "Happy Christmas!" James said cheerfully. He got a few mumbled replies from the Gryffindors. He was a Slytherin teacher. He wasn't meant to be being nice! He helped himself to small portions of the bacon and toast on offer, knowing that he would undoubtedly be having a huge Christmas lunch later and wanting to be able to appreciate it properly. The Dumbledores arrived 10 minutes or so later. "Merry Christmas, everyone," Albus said, beaming down at them, looking for all the world like a very skinny Santa Claus. "Happy Christmas," James replied. "What time are we going?" "Whenever you're ready, dear boy. Severus is probably already there." "Then won't mind us being so early?" "Early?" Abe asked. "This is a house for small children on Christmas morning. Early would probably be about 5. I'm sure 9 o'clock would be very civilized." "I'll go over now then, if that's okay. See you later, everyone." Going back down to his quarters, James packed the presents he was bringing into a bag and added a bottle of butterbeer as his contribution to the feast. He then wandered cheerfully up to Albus's office and lit the fire. "Number 12 Grimmauld Place," he said clearly, and was sucked through the whirling passageways. He stumbled out, coughing and sputtering to clear his lungs of the smoke. Someone grabbed his arm to steady him. He blinked a few times and opened his eyes. "Hello, Hermione," he said. Thanks." She grinned at him impishly, obviously trying not to laugh. Simon hadn't succeeded. He was snickering away in the corner. "I somehow didn't think you'd got any better at fluing." Normally, I don't have an audience, James said ruefully. Still, it shows that learning early is the best, and I obviously had a deprived childhood. Simon perked up at this. But I thought you were a pureblood, sir. He stopped, realizing this could be construed as a personal question. If you don't mind me saying so, of course. I am, to the extent that anyone can claim to be these days. My mother was from a squib line, and when my parents died, I was raised by her sister. I didn't even know what flu was until I was 12. I would have thought you'd be good at it, though, Simon said, unwilling to drop it. I mean, you're bloody brilliant at flying. It just goes to show that you can't be good at everything, Mr. Wood, he said, keeping his teacher voice. Then he smiled and kissed Hermione on the cheek. Happy Christmas. And to you, she said quietly. Oi, Evans! Watch it! Ron said, coming in to see what was happening. James was fairly sure he was just joking. Watch what? That's my wife you just guessed. So? I'm far more interested in you, truth be told. He managed with a completely straight face. He was actually not at all interested in either of them. Hermione was a girl, and Ron was straight, and completely not his type. No, he tended to go more for tall, dark guys. Simon sucked in his breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Ron laughed. Happy Christmas, James. Are you coming through, or were you two planning on staying here talking all morning? James let himself be pulled from the flu room through to the living room. It was lit with a warm, flickering glow from the huge fireplace and seemed even busier than it had been the last time he saw it. One corner of the room was taken up by a huge Christmas tree, brushing the ceiling at about 3 meters in height and beautifully decorated. Under it was a huge pile of parcels, all unopened. We wait until everyone's here, until we start. Then it's a free-for-all, Ron said, almost shouting to make himself heard. Give me that bag and I'll put them down for you. James paused for a moment to look around the room. Yes, he knew everyone here. Severus was sitting on a sofa in the far corner with another man. Who was it? They had their back to him, so he could only see the neatly trimmed white hair. He turned slightly, and James winced. Is that... he said, trailing off. Hermione followed the direction of his gaze and nodded. That's Remus, if that's what you mean. Remember how... James, he's a werewolf, bitten at a very young age. Most werewolves don't live to become an adult, so every moment he survives has been on borrowed time. In werewolf years, he must be something like 200. He's old, yes, but he's happy, and there would have been nothing you could do about it, so don't beat yourself up about it. What does he do now? He has a home in a werewolf pack. They have a small hamlet on the far side of the Forbidden Forest from Hogwarts. There's maybe 40 of them, mostly young. Some are families, but many of the children were abandoned by their parents. He's one of the elders and teaches the little ones their first lessons. That's the sort of thing he'd enjoy, isn't it? I know you weren't planning on telling anyone, but if you did, I think it should be Remus. He's accepted that you were gone, but it would mean a lot to him to know that you're alive and happy, and you're well on your way to love. I never said anything about... And nor did anyone else. But I can read you as easily as I can read Ron. Why don't you go and talk to them? You mean that they're actually talking? They get on very well now, actually, and Severus makes the wolfbane for all of Remus's pack every full moon. They can be remarkably similar, actually. I think Albus was very relieved. Apparently, order meetings could get very tense before they made up. With that, she gave him a gentle shove in that direction and picked her way through the crowd towards Ron. On his way over, James passed Alastair. He was sitting on the floor, happily teaching one of the younger Weasleys how to play Exploding Snap. He smiled at James as he passed, but didn't say anything. At least he wasn't looking sad. Not hugely happy, but not sad. That was about all they could hope for. Severus smiled as James approached. He looked around and decided just to sit on one of the beanbags on the floor so that he could take part in the conversation. About time you showed up, the older man said. I was the only Slytherin in a room full of Gryffindors. You had Alastair, James pointed out. One should not expect an 11-year-old to be able to stand with you against the masses. Well, I'm here now, and Abe is coming along soon, James said. Then he smiled broadly at Remus. Hello, I'm James Evans. Remus Lupin. Severus has mentioned you a few times. I only feel it fair to warn you that I'm a werewolf. I know. You're quite the celebrity after the last war. You don't mind, then? Why would I? It's only a problem at full moon, and only if you don't take the wolf's bane. Given that you seem to be one of Severus's friends, I can only assume that he supplies you with it. If you knew the number of people who didn't think like that. So you've taken on the defense position. You're not worried about the curse. James smiled. Remus seemed to be taking it about as seriously as he did. Not at all. Given how much Hogwarts seems to like me, I can't foresee any sort of problem with the curse. Too true the castle likes him, Severus said irritably. I assume you are the ward holder, then? He is indeed, Severus replied. We held the ceremony about 2 weeks ago, and there hasn't been a single fight since. Not even a scuffle. Everyone's been walking around like their birthday came early. Remus chuckled at this. I'll bet that has you worried. Imagine what they'll be like when it all calms down. There was a fresh burst of chatter over by the main door, and they looked over. There's Albus, Severus said, if you'll excuse me. We'll see you around, I'm sure, Remus said. Mr. Evans, if you would give me a hand upstairs, I have something I need to pick up from my room. Certainly. And it's James. To be honest, I'd rather forget that I teach some of the kids here. You'll have to tell me where to go. Remus guided him up to the first landing and into a small single room. As James would have expected from him, the room was neat and tidy, the bed made. Thank you, Remus said. I won't be a minute. I'm just meant to take my potion 2 hours after breakfast each morning. James gathered his nerve. Hermione was right. It wasn't fair to leave his almost godfather in the dark, especially given the fact that they were uncertain how much longer he'd last. Remus? Moony? Can I talk to you for a moment? Remus spun around, wand outstretched. James gulped as the wand swished. The door behind him swept shut, and a series of locking charms followed. He himself was propelled into a chair and fixed with a leg locker curse. Explain! The werewolf demanded. How do you know that name? I don't suppose you have a wet cloth? James asked, deciding it would be easiest if he showed him. This was supplied, and he scrubbed at his forehead, patting his robes to be certain he still had his concealer with him. When he thought he was done, he moved his hand, holding any loose wisps of hair out of the way. Harry? Remus whispered disbelievingly. James nodded and smiled. Ask me anything I should know. Constant vigilance. Why did Sirius escape Azkaban? It was the summer holiday between my second and third year at Hogwarts, James said, counting backwards on his fingers. The Weasleys went to Egypt, and there was a picture of them in the Prophet. Fudge gave him a copy when he visited Azkaban, and he saw Wormtail sitting on Ron's shoulder. He escaped and made his way to Hogwarts because he thought Wormtail might hurt me. It is you, then, Remus said, with relief and awe, his eyes bright with unshed tears. James Evans! That's the sort of thing Lily would have come up with. So obvious, yet so difficult to spot. I take it Severus doesn't know. No. You, Hermione, Albus, and Aberforth. That's all. I didn't know where you'd gone until today. Hermione pointed you out and said that I should tell you, but I wasn't sure I'd get a chance to today. So you're a defense master at Hogwarts now? Sirius used to joke that that's where you'd end up. We could never see you playing professional Quidditch or becoming an Auror like the rest of the Order. I received some offers, James admitted. You would never have accepted them, though. You couldn't cope with the media attention, and I suspect by the time you killed Voldemort, you had had more than enough of chasing dark wizards. Are you happy there? James nodded. It was always my home, and the company's good as well. Are you talking about Albus or Severus? Why does everyone seem to think that me and Severus should get together? You mean you aren't planning to? Well, yes, but it's not nice to tease me about it. There's a thin line between love and hate, Harry, and I think you've crossed it. You are remarkably similar, you know. Remus, what would Sirius have thought? Harry asked timidly. It's not something we ever discussed, I admit, but I think I have an idea of his reaction. The first thing he'd do would throw a tantrum and yell at Severus for a bit. You would, of course, be completely innocent in his eyes. After a while, he'd calm down, and you'd talk about him with him, and he'd see that you were serious about it, and it would be what you made you happy. Then he'd probably go and threaten Severus and say that if he ever did anything to hurt you, it wouldn't live to see the next day. After Severus convinced him he was serious, he would accept it. They wouldn't become best friends, but over time I think they would come to understand each other. They did already know each other. Harry, they saw figments of their imagination. To Sirius, Severus was the living example of what his parents wanted him to be. He was a Slytherin, magically powerful, good in lessons, responsible, and with a good knowledge of dark magic. Hating Severus was one of the ways he could rebel against his family. After a while, they'd escalated it so far that he believed he hated Severus as a person. Severus, on the other hand, only knew Sirius's worst side, the cruel, the pranks, the bullying, and the way the teachers favoured him despite his attitude in class. It was more or less like you and Draco Malfoy at Hogwarts. You didn't see past your houses. I guess. Thanks. We'd better go back downstairs again, or they'll be wondering where we are. As they went back down again, it felt more like a son supporting his aging father than a kindly stranger helping an elderly man. There was a cheer as they came back into the living room. Everyone was sitting down now, the adults on chairs and sofas, the children and younger adults who didn't have seats on the floor around the tree. Small plates of appetizers were being passed around. Smoked salmon, crisps, and olives from what he could see. Take a seat over here, Remus, Molly said, clearing Ron off an armchair near the tree. He took this good-naturedly and sprawled on the floor instead, leaning against Hermione's legs. James took a seat cross-legged next to him. Now, for those of you who don't know the rules, Arthur said clearly, one present each at a time, and you can't choose which one. I'll give out the first round. He went over to the tree and made a show of choosing the smallest presents there for each person and distributing them to his gathered friends and relations. A lot of the little ones looked a bit disappointed, eyeing a few large boxes they might have spotted bearing their name, but bounced on the parcels nonetheless, ripping the paper and leaving it in shreds on the floor. James opened his to find a guide to wards and warding, a thick book from Draco. Obviously, he was considered backwards in this area. Looking around the room, several of the others had also discovered books. Alastair looked delighted to have found a box of chocolate frogs from the Slytherin third years. When everyone had examined their present and thanked the giver, Molly chose a set of presents. Again, mostly small ones. Jane could see the logic in this. In building up the suspense, the children appreciated the large ones even more. He could imagine how curious they would be about the contents, since presumably most of the adults were in on this. They would have to wait until the first kid's turn to have a go at it. Soon each person had a heap of presents next to them. Clothes featured in a big way. Everyone, even James, had received a Weasley jumper. James couldn't see properly, but he thought Severus had received one too. There were also large quantities of sweets and books. The floor was a complete mess, strewn with multicolored and flashing paper so that you almost had to wade through it to reach the tree. Oliver and Charlie took pity on the children, and a lot of the adults, when their turn came, and deliberately selected the biggest present for everyone that they could find. James laughed when he opened his parcel to reveal a full set of Slytherin Quidditch robes from Severus and the present team. They were green and white, similar to the Merlin ones, green and black, but with a slightly different cut. The note attached informed him that he was now the official team coach and an honorary past member of the team. He watched carefully as Alastair slowly unwrapped his to reveal his broom. A look of wonder spread over the boy's face. Simon, sitting next to him, also looked impressed. After a moment of him gazing awestruck at the broom, James was unprepared when Alastair raced over and hugged him tightly. Awkwardly, he hugged back. He was a little uncomfortable with it, not having really had much physical contact with anyone beyond Ron, Hermione, and Draco before. "Thank you, Professor," Alastair mumbled into his robes. "It wasn't just me, it was Professor Snape as well." Alastair looked up just long enough to say, "He might kill me if I tried to hug him, though." James laughed. Severus certainly hadn't lost his touch. James himself would have expected to be hung, drawn, quartered, diced rather, and his body parts thrown to the giant squid. "He might surprise you," he said with an encouraging smile. "Go on, I'll take full responsibility if he attempts to murder you." More uncertainly, Alastair walked over to Severus and paused for a moment before clinging to him like a lifeline as he started to cry. Aware of everyone watching, Severus swung him up into his arms and carried him out. James followed hastily, gesturing that Simon should stay put. He found them in the deserted library, Severus drying Alastair's tears with an uncharacteristic gentleness. James stood in the doorway for a moment, not wanting to intrude. When Severus looked up and smiled at him, he came in and sat down next to them on the sofa. "Okay there, Alastair?" he asked. The boy nodded, sniffling. "Enjoying yourself?" Much to his surprise, Alastair smiled. "Everyone's really nice. I never expected to get so many presents." "Do you know Archie in 7th year?" Severus asked. "He's the one you should thank for that." Alastair seemed odd at that idea. To think that a 7th-year prefect would do all that for him. James looked at Severus over the top of his head, silently asking permission, and receiving a pleased nod. "Alastair, I know that you don't have any family left," he said bluntly but gently. "But to be honest, neither do I, and no one will ever be able to take the place of those you've lost. If you want, I'll be your uncle, if you will. That way you can always stay with me over the holidays, though it might be best if you stayed here for the rest of this one." "Really, sir?" "If it's what you want. We don't have to rush into things. You hardly know me as anything other than your teacher, but we can give it a go." "You really don't mind, Professor?" "Would I be offering if I did? No, this is something for you to think about. If in a few months you want to try, I'll see if I can't make it formal and adopt you. Until then, I'd like you to try to get to know me a bit better. One other thing, I don't think you need to keep on calling me Professor outside of school. My name is James. You're welcome to use it." "Wow!" "Think about it for me. Why don't we go back inside now? I don't think you've opened all of your presents yet. Tell them to start without us. There's a few things we need to talk about." Alastair smiled shyly at both of them and dashed back through. The two men watched his departing back. "That was kind, but are you sure about it?" Severus said seriously. "I wouldn't have asked if I wasn't. I've thought about it a great deal, and I think it's something that I have to do in a way. I remember what it was like for me growing up without parents, and I had other relatives, even if they didn't like me. It's as much a chance for me to have a family as for him. And if you have children of your own. That is very unlikely ever to happen, since I have no interest whatsoever in women. I think that any partner I would be prepared to have a permanent relationship with would be as accepting as I would." Severus looked at him for a moment, considering that. "I think you might be right there, given what I have seen of your choice in friends. Have you thought about what to do in the summer holidays?" "Not that much, actually. It depends on what happens with Lucius Malfoy. If it's all over by then, I'd like to see about a permanent home other than Hogwarts. I was thinking that I might take a house in Hogsmeade. It's a magical community near to Hogwarts, and there should be other kids there as well. It's near the werewolf place as well, and I thought I might see if I can't help Remus with some of his teaching. I'm not sure that I'd want to be in a city." "It sounds pleasant. If you want, I'll help you set up a room for him attached to your Hogwarts suite." "Thanks," James said. It surprised him how much Severus's approval meant to him. He was a little scared at the prospect of being responsible for an 11-year-old, but this felt to him the right thing to do. Alastair's surprise at receiving presents had brought back echoes of his own 11-year-old self. While there was nothing he could do about his own past, there was so much he could do about Alastair's future. So far, they were getting on fine, already past the distant teacher-student relationship, and he would build on that slowly. Hopefully, he was different enough from Alastair's parents that it wouldn't feel like he was trying to take their place. Maybe that was why, while he was obviously happy enough at Grimmauld Place, a permanent place in the Weasley family wasn't really for him. They slipped quietly back into the living room together. All of the presents had by this time been opened, and the floor was a sea of garish colors. As they came in, Molly rushed out with Ginny and Fleur in the direction of the kitchen, where a remarkable dinner was being prepared. George slipped after them, supposedly to help. James made a mental note to watch what he ate. James was drawn into a conversation, Remus and Aberforth, about the standards of students in his classes and what exactly he was teaching each year. Severus seemed to be trapped in a corner with Fred Weasley, looking resigned. He seemed relieved when Molly appeared again in the doorway. "Lunchtime," she said with a smile. "Come through." The older of the children dashed through, the younger ones being scooped up by parents, and the very youngest being rescued by house elves and taken off for naps. James followed at a more sedate pace with the rest of the adults. "What was that all about?" he asked Severus. "Fred, you mean? He was trying to recruit me. They've been offering me a job in their business for years." "He's only one of the best potion masters in the world," Fred said, joining them with his 4-year-old daughter draped over his arm. "We're decent at potions, but we can really deal with a specialist." "I think parents everywhere would be in trouble if your pranks got any more sophisticated," James said ruefully, thinking of the few pranks that had been tried in his lessons. He'd not been hit by any of them, but one or two had come close, and only quick reflexes had saved him. As they reached the long kitchen, James found a seat at the table marked by a place guard. The table was beautifully set with a pristine white tablecloth and silver dishes. At intervals along the table were blue candles set in ornate silver candlesticks, and matching crackers were stacked neatly in sixes. He was seated quite happily between Alastair and Hermione. James noted with approval that the children seemed to be mixed in with the adults, sitting in twos around the table. Each had an adult next to them to pour their drink and cut up their food, should it be required. Maybe when they were older, they would be given their own end, or even their own table when their numbers increased, but for now, this seemed sensible. His mouth watered as he took in the platters on the table. Turkey and stuffing, goose, roast potatoes and parsnips, sprouts, bacon, sausages. The choice seemed endless. He heaped his plate, pouring himself a flask of wine. Alastair looked at him for guidance when a jug of butterbeer was passed down to him. Simon had already poured himself a full mug and looked very smug. James knew that this was undoubtedly a treat for him. Usually Hogwarts students didn't get it until they started visiting Hogsmeade. The other children all had pumpkin juice. "Try it," he suggested. "It's butterbeer." Alastair dribbled a little into his mug and tentatively poured it into his mouth. He paused thoughtfully for a moment as he considered the taste. For a moment, James thought he wouldn't like it. Then he grinned and poured himself a mug that was nearly overflowing. The main course was dealt with in short order, everyone probably eating far more than they should have. Finished, they leaned back in their chairs, stomachs full, and talked for a while as a few house elves popped in to clear away the plates. James had always the Hogwarts food excellent, but this had surpassed all previous bests. It didn't take too long before the kids started getting restless. The crackers were handed out, and around the table, everyone crossed arms and pulled together. There was a series of loud pops, and items of every sort erupted from the cardboard. From James's own, a set of Weasley's whiz-bangs, guaranteed safety within enclosed spaces, burst and showered sparks down on them. Of course, all of the crackers would be from Weasley's wizarding wheezes. Where else? He put his admiral's hat on his head and read through the incredibly cheesy joke, donating the wizard's chess set he'd received to Alastair since he himself already owned one. As soon as everyone seemed ready, the crackers vanished and the new plates arrived on the table. There was a Christmas pudding, burning with a blue flame, in the very center, and various chocolatey desserts for those that way inclined. James, not liking fruit puddings, cut himself a generous slice of chocolate tart and piled this with ice cream. When everything had been eaten and a satisfied quiet had fallen on the room, Ginny and Neville took the children out. Shortly afterwards, shrieks and giggles could be heard echoing from all corners of the house. Neville poked his head round the door after a particularly loud scream and said apologetically, "No one's been murdered. We're playing sardines." He left again as a series of reminiscences about Christmas days of the past began. Apparently, Ginny had always been the best at sardines in her youth, with Charlie a close second. Percy had undoubtedly been the worst, disliking dirt and dust, and the twins were good, but had insisted on hiding together, making things harder for themselves. It certainly sounded like they were having fun, James noticed, getting a little restless himself that Oliver and Charlie were exchanging glances. 5 minutes or so later, a redhead poked itself around the kitchen door, taking in the surroundings and ready to bolt if necessary. "I'm allowed in here, aren't I?" Bill's eldest son asked boldly. When no objections were made, he came in properly and surveyed the room critically. With the cupboards full, there wasn't that much room for improvisation, so he slid under the table, hidden by the legs and the tablecloth, and stayed there, perfectly still and quiet. Ginny came in a moment later, holding a toddler by the hand. They made a show of looking behind the door and in a few of the cupboards. "Is he under the table?" the little girl asked loudly, receiving indulgent smiles from the adults. Why don't you have a look? Jenny suggested. The girl crawled under. He's here! She announced. We've got to hide now! Jenny looked mortified at acting this way in front of her old teachers, but crawled under herself, ending up at Hermione and James's feet. One by one, the children trickled in and squashed in under the table until 6-year-old Stefan came in. Sardine! They chorused together. He looked a bit disappointed, but ran off to hide as the others began counting loudly and not completely together, since some of them seemed to be having problems after they passed 20. When they began to leave, Charlie and Oliver stood up, obviously intending to join in. James shifted restlessly in his seat. Hermione looked at him and leaned over to whisper in his ear, If you want to, just go. Make the most of it while you can. He needed no further urging and followed them out, fully intending to win this game on his first try. From the whispered conversations under the table, he had picked up a working understanding of the game, even though he'd never played it himself. It was late when James returned to Hogwarts. Severus, Minerva, and Albus had gone on ahead to ensure that those students who had remained at school with Phileas, Poppy, and Pomona were getting ready for bed and not wreaking havoc around the castle. James had stayed and helped bundling toddlers into pajamas at bed. He had then thanked Molly and Arthur for the day and said goodbye to Remus, promising to visit him at his home soon. This was what Christmas should be like, he thought fuzzily as he climbed into bed. He didn't get any further than that, his eyes drooping shut as his head hit the pillow.